Hi everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of this Let's Make video for the basic interaction system. It's been a while since the intro video, so I'm sorry about the delay. In this video, we will set up the character input, we're going to create the parent interaction class, and we're going to create a widget blueprint for that hovering UI. We won't do too much with the UI just yet other than creation. We're just going to have it in place for another video after this. Now, if I take a look around my scene, you'll notice that all the previous assets are gone. I have a new folder. I'm going to be rebuilding all the assets from scratch. The one thing I do have is this third-person template character. If I open it up, you can see this is the default third-person template. All the code in here is for movement. They have the event for jumping. They have things for moving the camera around and all that stuff. This is what I'm going to be using to build the interaction system around for the character. Again, you don't need to use the third-person template if you don't want to, but my code does rely on having camera control. You can use some other things to kind of do it your own way, but I won't be going over that in detail here. Alright, so let's get started. Now, the first thing we want to do is create the input for our character interaction. This is normally a button press. Player can attempt it when they're close enough to the interactive actor. I just like to use the E key for my interactions, but feel free to add whatever you'd like. Whatever is needed for your game. Let's add that new input event. We're going to go up to settings and then down to project settings. This will bring up a project settings dialog box. And on the left hand side we have a lot of categories here, but we're going to go to input. These are all the input controls we currently have. You can see that we have the jump already in here under action mappings and access mappings here. We have the move forward, turn, look, and so forth. Now, whenever we add an input to our settings file, an event is created that we can use inside of our blueprints. This is the event that will get called whenever you actually press that button or move that input in some way. You can already see here we have the default input mappings, like the jump that we saw earlier, and move forward, all that kind of stuff, look around. So all we need to do is just create a input mapping for our interaction, and we'll have access to use that within our blueprints. So you see we have two different categories. We have action mappings and access mappings. Now the action mappings are controls that have two states. They're either pressed or they are released. And it only happens at one time. This is different than the access mappings because the access will always be going off, and they'll have an output float of like -1 to 1 or whatever you kind of put in there. It can kind of fluctuate in between. It's always kind of going and keeping track of it. We don't need an access for our interaction. We just want to know when the player has just pressed the button, when they just do it. We don't need to know any other information besides whether it's on or off. So let's go ahead to action mappings, and we're going to press the little plus sign to add a new one in. We need to rename this. We're going to call this one interact. And this is just going to be what our event is called. So when we're in our blueprints, we're going to search for this name, and this will pop up as an event. If I go to the drop-down menu, this is where we put in what key we want to use. Again, I'm going to use the E key. So if I type in E, I can scroll down. Let's see if I can find keyboard and just the E key. Now, this plus sign here can add in more than just one key. You can have multiple keys on the keyboard, or in our case, we can even do something for a controller. So if we add another one in, we can go to the just generic gamepad, and we can look for the face buttons. Now, these are the buttons that normally have its A, B, X, Y, and Xbox. It's the X triangle circle for a PlayStation. But they do it kind of just in position because it's always different depending on the controller you have. I'm going to choose the face button left. So on an Xbox controller, that would be the X button. And that's not bad for like picking up an item or interacting with something. Usually A is for jumping. X is good for doing other things. Now that we have the input created, we can call the event within our character. So we can actually just close right out of this, and it'll save everything for us to use. Let's go ahead and let's set it up in our character. If I double-click our character and bring this back up, we can right-click an empty space within our event graph here, and we can do a search for our interact. And right here is an event under our action events, and it's our named interact. And this is going to pop up with the pressed, released, and a key structure. We can't really do anything with this yet, though. We have nothing for our character to interact with. And that's kind of the point of this section of the video. We're going to create that parent interaction that we can actually walk up to and interact with. But it's good to have this here all set and ready to go. We'll leave it here for now, and we can close out of the character. We'll come back to this once we have our parent class set up. So we need to create our blueprint for the interaction parent. And the idea is to create a blueprint class that will contain pretty much all the code that any of our interactive items in the game will ever need. That way we create subclasses based on those children classes that they won't have to rewrite any code. It's all done within the parent, and if a specific class, subclass needs it to work slightly differently, it's very easy to override any of those functions to get some different desired effect. It makes things much easier, and it also allows us in the character just to use the single parent variable, but still put in those children classes into it. You don't have access to the children functions when it's inside of the parent variable. You can only call the parent stuff on it. But because everything is in the parent that we're ever going to need, it doesn't matter. It's perfect for us. It'll be awesome. And it's a nice way just to set up this hierarchy of classes. So let's go ahead and let's create the new blueprint class. I'm going to right click in my content browser. I'm going to say new blueprint class, and I'm going to select the actor. Let's rename this to BP interaction parent. This is going to be my interaction parent class. Everything that's going to be based on this can be like interaction child something, whatever we want it to be. Switch, a elevator, a pickup, whatever we want to interact with. If I double click it, we're going to open it up and go to the viewport. And right now there's nothing really in it. We just have this default scene root. Now I like to use icons for my specific classes. You don't have to do it this way, but I like having that kind of option where if you have an artist that can create a specific icon, or if you have one, that kind of gets the point across of what each thing does. It's kind of nice to have. The sad part is that sometimes those get hidden behind geometry and you don't see the icon, but it's just something I've kind of gotten into the habit of doing. Again, you don't necessarily need to, but you do need some sort of root. Which means you can keep this default scene root, or you can do something like what I'm doing with the billboard to create this icon. So we can add that in by going up to Add Components and search for billboard. We're just going to drop in the regular billboard. I'm going to rename it to icon, and we're going to drop it right on the root to replace it. Keeping it as this default icon texture is fine for now. The reason why we want to have some other root here is because all of our other components we want to be able to manipulate and move them based on different needs. We need to scale them or rotate them or do anything depending on the current interaction that we're creating. If it's the root, you can't actually do a lot of those things. You'll see that I only have absolute scale. I don't have access to anything else because it is the root of this object. All of our interactions, all the children classes, what we're currently going to be doing is we're all going to have a physical mesh. There's going to be some sort of visual, physical thing in the world. So we want a static mesh component. We need a sphere component, which will be able to tell us when we're close enough to interact with the object or not, and then pass that information to the player. And finally, we'll need that UI widget. Which floats above it, tells the player what button to press, and pretty much just tells them which one they're actually selecting before they press the interaction key. So let's add some of those in. I'm going to go up here, get a static mesh. We're going to add in a static mesh component. And I can call this one interact mesh. Let's add another component called, it's going to be the sphere collision. And this one we can say interact trigger. And finally, let's do a widget. This is the 3D widget, and we can call this one interact UI. So let's go over each one and set up their defaults. Now, the interaction mesh over in the details panel right now has no mesh here. Let's go ahead and add one in. I'm just going to use the 1 meter cube with the nice smooth sides. You can use whatever you'd like, but the idea is that the parent class isn't really going to be anything. So a cube works pretty well for it. We're not going to really use the parent class in the game pretty much ever. We're only going to be using the subclasses and things like that. Next, we have the interaction trigger. Its radius is really small to start off with. It's 32. So we can increase this a decent amount. Let's bump it up to like 200 or so. And that is pretty good for now. We're going to actually have control over it a little bit more through a variable, so we can change it in the editor and stuff, but for now, this default is good. The interaction UI, we have to add a class for. So we actually have a widget class we need to go and add in. But we can change this space from world to screen. And the reason why I'm doing screen space right now is just to keep things moving more quickly. It puts this widget in screen space based on its actual 3D location. But it will just be right on the screen, meaning we don't have to turn it to face the player. It doesn't get hidden by objects in front of it or anything like that. It's always going to be there for us to see and interact with. But we have to create a widget class for it. So we can do that real quick. If we move this to the side, we can go back to our content browser, right-click, and we need to go down to User Interface, and then at the very bottom, Widget Blueprint. And I like to name these WBPs for Widget Blueprints, and we're going to call this one Interaction UI. Yeah. Now, we're not going to do anything in here yet. This is just going to be blank for us, but we do want to just have something there so we can plug it in right away. Now, back in our interaction parent class, we can go to our widget class and go to the interaction UI. This interact UI is from the previous one. It's my demonstration I had from the first video. But because we named ours interaction UI, we're going to select that one, and it should be blank. We'll compile and save, and we'll get back to it later to update and make sure it works for us. Now, like I said previously, I like to set up the parent class and everything to be very flexible for these subclasses. But this also means that we can create variables and things to be editable in the editor itself. With this in mind, we can actually kind of prepare for edge cases where we need something very specific and only happens maybe once or twice. And it's easier just to make some changes in the editor. We don't want to do this for every item, but it's nice to be able to deal with edge cases very quickly. So what are the things we want to be able to change? Well, for the mesh, we want to be able to change what it looks like, so having access to a static mesh variable it's using is very nice. But we also want to be able to move, rotate, and scale that mesh. That way it's not stuck located at the origin or using its default scale when we need it to be changed in some way. Now we can do this by adding in a new variable. We can do that right here under the variables and click the little plus sign. And in our details for this variable, we can change it to a transform. Now, a transform has three variables kind of stuck right inside of it. It has a vector for location, a rotator just for the object rotation, and another vector for its scale. We want to rename this to mesh transform. And by hitting this little editable icon, or the little eye down here, we can allow it to be used inside the details panel in the editor itself. If I minimize this and go to our interaction parent and drag it out, let's jump over to it. I'm going to hit F4. It's a shortcut to go right to the details panel. And we can see all the details of it currently. It's normal transform stuff. And under the default category, we have that variable we just made. It's called the mesh transform. So we can actually change things in here that would affect its local transform. We'll move the mesh around, scale it, rotate it, do whatever we need to without affecting any of the other components. Now, one thing we want to do is, instead of leaving it in this default category, to actually put our variables in a similar category, because this is a kind of setup variable. let's kind of create a category for that called setup. That way when we create a bunch of these other variables, we can drop it right in here as well. Now, next thing we want to do is create that static mesh variable. That way we can update the mesh based on whatever we want to in the editor as well. We're going to call this the interaction mesh, and we're going to drop it into the same setup category. So let's go ahead, go back to the plus sign, add this in. We're going to go to the variable type and search for static mesh. And we just want the static mesh, not the actor. That would be an actor actually in the world in use right now. We have to reference something there. We want something to reference from our content browser, a mesh that we can use. We're going to click on reference, and let's rename this to interaction mesh. I do have to name it different than this component, interact. If you don't, it'll throw an error saying it's being used. So interaction seems like a good compromise. Now again, we want to change its category. You can change it up here in the drop-down, type it in, or you can actually just drag it right onto setup. And same thing, we're going to hit the little I, compile, save. And you'll notice that when we compile, there is no variable in here right now. We need to add in that same cube just so that we get something in there. It doesn't set it to nothing. Now that we have all our variables, we need to actually use them in some way. So in our case, we're going to be changing the mesh out for the mesh variable. We're going to be updating the local offset with the transform. We're going to do this through a function, and the function is going to be set up in the construction script to run. Now we put it in the construction script because every time we make a change in the editor, that script is run. So the way we add functions is right over here as well. It's going to be the plus sign. The override is for functions that already exist. We're going to be using this a little bit later. We won't get into it quite yet. So let's add a new function in, and we need to call this one setup mesh. Again, we can go to the details and we can drop it into our category. So here we see I have my setup category that I created for the variables. I'm going to drop it in there just to keep everything organized. Now, we need to update the mesh for the new static mesh. So we can drag out the component, drop it right in. If we drag a line out, we can do a search for set static mesh. And in here, we can connect up to our beginning of our function. Down here it says new mesh, and we can hook up a input to that, a variable. So if we hold down the control key and drag out our interaction mesh, we can get an automatic get. If you drag it out normally, you can pick from this list, get or set. The control key is just a shortcut. Alt key, drag and drop, is for setting. Shortcuts are really nice. Now that we've added this in, when this function gets called, it's just going to take our interaction mesh, our component, and it's going to set the static mesh to our variable, which right now is the same, but that's kind of what we want it to be. Now, next we want to change the interaction mesh location, rotation, scale, things like that. So I'm going to copy over the interact mesh. I'm going to set relative, we're going to say transform. And this brings in that transform, and we can do another control, click drag, and plug this in. Compile and save. If we look at the defaults for a mesh transform, everything's 0 and scale is all 1, which is just the default for everything. That means it'll all be at the origin location, rotation will all be the same, all zeroed out, and scale will all be 1. Now that we've created it, we do need to comment just to make sure everything kind of stays put, and we can make sure that everything is just organized, and we can write something like setup mesh, set static mesh, and relative transform. And we can just leave notes for ourselves for later. Set in the construct. Of course, that's not the best note, but you get the idea. And try and make sure anyone reading this could understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. If I close out of that, we can actually delete all this from our event graph. We don't need any of that right now. but we want to go to the construction script. You can get that here, or if it's not up there, you can double-click construction script down here. If you ever accidentally close out of these things, you can double-click them on the left and get them back. Inside the construction script, we have the event where everything gets fired off anytime this actor gets updated in the editor or anything like that. And we can go to our setup mesh and drag this out and plug it in. Compile, save. And if we go back to into our editor, we can make changes and see if it works. Let's say I change this to the sphere. In the updates with that, let's go ahead to the mesh transform. If I move the X, rotation, position, everything like that kind of works the way it should. Now everything is based off of this object. So that means that if I zero everything back out, and I want my actor to move to the right-hand side, you kind of have to do it based on the actor's rotation and everything. If I rotate it 50 degrees that way and I move it in the X, let's do it like 2. It'll actually move in the X of not the world, but of the object itself. So if I go to the object rotation, you can see the gizmo kind of updates, and this is really the X direction for this actor. So just be aware of that. Everything is relative based on everything, you move this guy around. Let's zero it all back out. We can zero out rotation and change this back to a cube. In each of our subclasses that we make, we're going to be changing these defaults to match whatever the needs of that subclass are. We don't necessarily want to go into each actor every time we place it and change everything then. We want to have these subclasses just change them by default into the things we need so we can just place them and go. We don't have to update anything after that. So let's set up the sphere collision in the same way. If I'm selecting my class, I can hit Control-E to bring up the editor right away. We need 2 variables for the sphere. We need one that is a float that's going to control the radius of that sphere. We're going to need one for the location. That'll be a vector. We're not using a transform because we don't really want to scale the sphere, because that's going to kind of mess with what the radius is. You're going to have to figure out both of them. And it's just easier to use one or the other. Radius is nicer to work with, I think. And we don't need to rotate it because we're not making a lopsided sphere. So rotating it doesn't really do anything. It's always going to be the same radius everywhere, so it's not going to change that shape ever. So we're going to go to our variables, press 2 variables, and we're going to go to the first one and change it to a float. Let's rename this one to trigger radius. And again, we can hit it as editable, and we can drop it in our setup. The next one, we're going to do the same thing, change it to the vector. We're going to call this one trigger location. Again, editable, and let's drop it into this setup. And we can kind of reorder these however you want. It's kind of up to you how you want to do it. You could even have different categories instead of just one setup. You could have a mesh setup, a trigger setup, a UI setup. But one category for now is fine. So next we need to create the function that we can call within this construction script. We go up to our functions again, let's hit the plus sign. We're going to call this one setup trigger. We're just going to go ahead, drag the trigger down, and we're going to set radius, set sphere radius, plug it in, and we're going to control drag out our trigger radius and plug this in. This update overlap doesn't really matter for us. We can keep it on just in case. We're going to do the same thing for trigger location. We can click and drag it out. Let's copy the interact trigger, and let's set relative location. And we can set it as right here. Plug it in, compile, save, grab everything. And to comment, I think I forgot this, I just hit C the C key when you have everything kind of surrounded, comments it in a box, which just makes everything kind of organized nicer. So trigger, and normally you'd put in some nice description there of what you're doing. Back in the construction script, we're going to drag out the setup trigger. We'll drop this into the setup category as well, and put it right behind our setup mesh. And again, you can comment all of these just with the C key. Let's just do that real quick. Construction script, setup, interaction. Based on user variables. That's good enough for now. So perfect. If we minimize and go back to our object, you'll notice that the sphere is gone. That's because we didn't actually change these to be back to the default. So the trigger radius is set at 0, and that means our by default it's setting everything to that sphere to 0 radius. Let's put the default back to 200. The local offset at 0 is fine for now, and now it's back to normal. Again, if we select it, press F4, brings us to the details. Here's our radius, our trigger location, mesh transform, all that stuff in the same category, and I can drag this bigger and smaller. Okay, and the last thing we want to do is set up the interact UI. Again, we're going to have 2 variables, but this one's going to, again, be a little different. Let's go ahead, let's add in 2 variables. And we'll select the top one, and we're going to change this one to a vector. Mine's already a vector. If yours isn't, just go ahead and change it to one. And we're going to call this one UI location. Again, make it editable, and we can drop it up under the setup. Okay, the mesh stuff on the bottom. Trigger, then UI, then mesh. The second variable we'll select, and we're going to set this to be a text variable. Let's rename this one to UI description, or actually let's call it interact description. Interact description. Again, make it editable. We can compile, save. Let's drop it under our setup. For some reason I have a bunch of zeros in there, so let's just delete that out. And we want to, in the default for the interact description, let's call it interact. That'll be the description that pops up for this particular interaction when we look at the UI. UI location, we can stay the same for now as well, but we probably want it to be up from this original location. It looks like if we have the interaction UI and we drag it up 50 to 100, 100's pretty good. We don't want the UI sitting inside of this box here, so let's actually move it up to 100 by default. So UI location in the Z, which is the up and down, let's put it to 100. Compile, save. Back in the construction script, we need to add this function that will use these 2 variables now. So let's add a new function called setup UI. And we can drop this into our setup category. And again, we're going to grab the UI here, and we're going to set location, relative location. Hook it up, and we're going to grab the UI location and drop it in with control just to do the quick get, and we can comment. Now, I'm not putting the interaction description here. And the reason is because we, number one, don't have a interaction description. We don't have a text widget in there to take in whatever we want it to say. But also because we're using a 3D widget, and there's actually no way to do it in the construction script. It doesn't like it. For whatever reason, I believe Unreal just doesn't have those created until runtime, which means we have to do it at the begin play. So let's call this one setup UI, set location offset, or whatever you want to call it. So now that that's done, our construction script, we just need to add this to the last part. So let's go ahead, hook it up to after everything. We set up the mesh, the trigger, the UI. We have defaults for everything kind of set up. and we should be good. So if I go back out here, we can press F4. This interact description, it still has the weird zeros in there. I think it's because I changed it from a vector to the current value. So if I just hit the little back button, it goes back to my current default value. So everything looks good here. We can move on to creating some more of those functions that will actually drive this parent class and let the player know they're able to interact with it. Let's jump back into the blueprint, and we can start in on the event graph. Now, the first thing we need to do is to tell the character that they are able to interact with this now. We need to find out when they hit this trigger, when they enter into the sphere, and tell them they now can interact with this object. So we can right-click and say Add Event on the trigger, and we're going to say Begin Overlap, and we're going to right-click again and say End Overlap. It's going to add in both of these events, and I can comment it right away just to kind of keep it organized. Trigger overlap. So every time the player runs into it or leaves it, we do something based on that. So the other actor on both of these are whoever hit it. It doesn't necessarily need to be the character, and we want to make sure that it is, though. So if we drag this out, we can cast to, and our character is called the interaction character. Interaction character. So here's our BP interaction character. I can copy paste and plug these in to both, because we only want to do something if we hit this specific class. This will also get called if we hit a subclass of it as well. Which is nice. Now that we have the class being casted to, we need to call something from it, but we don't have anything there yet. So inside the interaction character, we're going to add in two functions. One is going to add in that interaction, the other one's going to remove it. So let's add two functions in. We're going to rename the first one to add interaction. And the second one's going to be called remove interaction. And it's going to add them to a list. It's going to be an array of the interact parent type. So we're going to keep track of this list. And the reason why we're doing it this way is because when the player is running around, they might run into like 3 items that are very close to each other. So by putting them into a list, we can then iterate through each one, figure out which one is the best to interact with, and choose that one. Instead of kind of just taking the last one we ran into or something and doing that one. This system makes it so that the player has a lot more control over it, and they understand exactly what's going on and how to utilize that system. So let's jump into the add interaction. And when we select the function, the input here, we have the inputs and outputs we can add on to it. So if we say new input, we can go to our class, and that's the interaction parent class. And we want to get a reference to it. And we're going to say this is interaction. Now, the interaction was going to come through here. It's going to be sent over from our parent when we hit the sphere. It'll tell us this is the interaction we're hitting. Keep track of it until we need to remove it when we leave that sphere's area. So we drag this out, we can say add. And add's going to pop up with this array. And we have an add and add unique. Add will just add it no matter what. And add unique is going to only add it if there isn't another one in there with the exact same object, the exact same actor, which is what we want. We don't want an interact parent to accidentally get added twice. We only need it there once. But we don't have a variable hooked up to it. A nice way to add in variables is just to drag off a line and go to promote to variable. Make sure you're not doing local. They'll just be within the function. We want to make sure it's a global variable that can live in the actor forever. So promote to variable. We're going to move it down and call this interaction list. Compile save. And we're going to copy this, jump over to our remove, paste it in, and do the same with the input here. We're going to select our remove, go over to inputs, and it should have the same variable type there automatically for us. Call it interaction again. And this time we can drag out a line and say remove item instead of add. And this will just go through our list, find out if this interaction we're passing is there, and if it is, it'll remove it from that list. Now that we have both of those, we should be good to call them from our interaction parent. So if we jump back over, we can grab a line from the interaction character, and we can call add interaction will pop up. And here is where we have this input, which is our interaction parent class, which is us. But we do need to supply it with the object that is actually in the editor, that's in the game. We do this by getting a reference to ourselves. So we drag out a line, we can type in self, and use the reference to ourselves. Now this just says that specific instance in the world, that's the one you're pointing at. And it'll keep track of that. Same thing with the remove. This is where we're going to take it away. So let's say remove interaction, and same thing, get a reference to ourselves. Compile, save, and now we have everything set up there. When we walk into the sphere, we add the interaction so we can do something with it in the character. When we leave it, we're not close enough to interact anymore, we take it away. The last two functions I need to create for this parent class, at least at this very moment, are the interaction itself, we need to be able to call, and we also need a way to toggle on and off that interaction UI. By default, it should be kind of hidden, and when we get close enough and we're looking at it, that's when we make it visible to that. Let's create both of those right now. The only thing is they probably really won't do much yet. Our interaction UI doesn't really have anything in there, so we could add a box in just so we can see it. Let's do that real fast. In the content browser, let's jump to our Widget Blueprint. Now in this UI, we need to kind of set up a box, and it doesn't necessarily need to be centered or anything. We do that in the 3D widget itself. We just need something in the corner here. If you are unfamiliar with the Widget Blueprint editor, it's very similar to the blueprint. It's just different functions and different things that you can use. There's a lot of stuff that you can do in regular blueprints you can't do here, and vice versa. In the graph, this looks a lot more like the blueprint editor. I can delete out this stuff right away. We don't need it at the time. And in the designer, this is where we're creating what our UI is, really, as well as doing animation work. Let's create just a box, and we can do that with an image. We might not keep this, we'll see for later. Let's just drop it in for now. We'll keep the anchor, this big thing in the upper left-hand corner. That's good for now. What we do need to do is put in zeros for the offset there, so it sticks right in the corner. And we need to change its size. We could make this one like 50 by 50 size for the time being. We could probably do bigger. Let's do 100 by 100. File save, and we're just going to leave this for the time being. We're not going to do anything more with it. We just need something that we can see. So back in the viewport, you still can't see it because it's in the screen space. If I change this back to world space, you can see it's up top here. Now, this is because our draw size is at 500 by 500. We just need to match whatever it is in the widget blueprint, so 50 by 50. The pivot point is at 0.5 by 0.5, meaning it's right in the center of it. If it's at 0, 0, it's in that corner. This is just saying to go halfway between the upper left and the lower right. We're going to change this back to screen space. It'll disappear on us, but that's fine. Save, compile, and one thing we want to do with this selected is scroll down to the visibility, and we want to turn it off by default. Because what will happen is if we have it all on by default, the player will see the UI over every single item when they open up the game for the first time. And it won't turn off until we like run into it and run away from it kind of thing. We don't want that. So it always starts with off, and it only will become visible once we're going to be interacting with it to tell us, hey, this is the object you will interact with. So we need a function for that. We won't be turning it on and off from in here. We would be doing that from the character, but we do need the function here just to make it easier. The character just calls the function, tells it to be on or off, and it does it. Let's add a new function in, and we're going to call this one toggle UI visibility. or just UI. Toggle UI is fine for now, because it might do something other than just visibility. For instance, if you want to play an animation or do something else or whatever. Again, we want to bring in an input. We want to know if it's either going to be on or off. And that's going to be a Boolean, so when we say new, Boolean pops up automatically. That's awesome. Keep that there. And we're going to say be active. I mean, we could even do something like be visible. Naming things, super helpful if you do it in a way that makes sense. Always try to. Always try and improve your naming conventions. Now we're just going to grab our interact UI and we're going to say set visibility. And we have this right here. We can plug this in here, and because it's the visibility and it's the exact same kind of naming convention, we'll plug it right in. We don't even have to like do the opposite. If it's visible, it'll be checked. Same thing happens for this. Again, I'm leaving it kind of open to if you want to add anything else after it. I don't need anything myself. We're just going to have it pop up right away and disappear right away. I'll comment it. Visibility. So with that set, we're good. Again, we're going to be doing this inside the character at the next tutorial when we actually choose which one we're interacting with. The toggle UI, we can drop this under like, I don't know, a UI category or something. And we just need one more function, which is the interact function. So again, we're going to hit new function, say interact, and we'll drop this under the interact category. And this will do nothing. The only thing we might want to do is do like a print string, just to make sure that it is working kind of thing. We'll say interacted. Now, the reason why we're doing absolutely nothing in here is because the parent class doesn't really do anything. What would be good is bringing in the character that's interacting with this. And the reason why I would do it here instead of when we are in our event graph adding to it, just because we added in this character doesn't necessarily mean they're the one that's going to press that button and interact with it. Maybe there's two characters standing around. Especially with a multiplayer game, this would be a huge issue if you based it off on the last person who would run into it. So it's best if we would bring it in this way, and we do the same thing. From our character, when we press the interact key, we pass along data of which character is interacting with it. So let's do that. Let's have this in the parent class because it's absolutely necessary for some of the things we might want to do. Select the interact, new input. Let's go to interact character. And here's our BP interaction character. Reference it. And we're going to call this one character. So we're going to bring this, drag it out, and say promote to variable. And we're going to promote it to a variable we can save for later. We'll call this one interact character. And we can drop this one in our interaction group, file save. And again, we don't do anything else, you know. So the print string will be fine for now. Eventually we can delete this out. Let's leave it in there for now, just so when we first test it, we can find out if it's working or not. But unfortunately, we're not going to get to that until we update our character. We're going to do that in the next video. At this point in time, we have the setup for the parent class pretty much all done. We have everything from the radius to the UI location to everything like that set up. In the next video, we're going to go over how to integrate that character choice. When he walks up to an object, how he actually interacts with it. He'll press the button and we'll get that string to play. And we'll be, all set for all the subclasses after that. All right. Thanks for sticking around. See you next time.